Hi, my name is Max Spade, and this is my presentation on Odilon Redon, Fabricated Reality. So, a short biography before we begin. Born Bertrand Jean Redon, he was born April 22nd, 1840, in Bordeaux, France. He came from a family of wealthy slave traders. Originally, they lived in New Orleans, but they moved to France before his mom had him. He was a very artistic child. His father encouraged him to go into architecture, and he did apply to an architecture school, but he was rejected. So instead, he just continued with, working to become an artist, which he was able to do because of his family's wealth from the slave trade. At the age of 30, he fought in the Franco-Prussian War, which the French lost. And after that, he dealt with PTSD for the rest of his life. He was famous initially for his charcoal drawings called his noirs, but an 1884 novel called Au revoir by Joris Karl Huysmans really cemented his fame as a master of the macabre. The novel by Huysmans follows an anti-hero who is an older, wealthy aesthete. He's very decadent. His passions in life are to follow the most decadent and macabre lifestyle possible through collecting dark art such as Redon's noirs, by having weird sex, by being cruel to others. And that book actually became very popular with aesthetes. So people like Oscar Wilde, for example, who were part of that group, they were big fans of that book, and it really helped cement his fame in specifically his image being tied forever with his noirs, which were an earlier part of his career. Eventually, his work transitioned into peaceful pastel works. He died July 6, 1916 in Paris, and he was a very important part of the symbolist movement, which sought to capture the feelings of things over what they actually look like. A big part of symbolism was a rejection of romanticism. They saw romanticism as tired, as something that had already been done before, and they were pushing to do art in a way that had not been done, especially because with the invention of photography, there was less of a need for artists to have to capture something perfectly photorealistic, and they wanted to see what else art was capable of doing. They wanted to push the bounds of what it could be. They were big inspirations and leading up to Dada and Surrealism later on. So here's the first piece I want to talk about. This is the Parallel Blade Landscape from 1868. This is a pretty good example of his earlier work. The earlier work that I saw, it's a lot of landscapes. He was able to do actually very realistic portraits, which as we'll go on, you'll see as it becomes more abstract. So with this piece, you can see a lot of the heavy brushwork and his usage of color. Redon is very famous for his use of color as being a colorist. But it is still recognizable. It's still a pretty realistic scene. If you held this up to where he had painted it or had drawn it, you'd probably be able to recognize the area. This is a quote from him that I thought summed up why he transitioned from a realistic style to that symbolism style. I have often, as an exercise and as a sustenance, painted before an object down to the smallest accidents of its visual appearance. But the day left me sad and with an unsatiated thirst. The next day I let the other source run, that of imagination, through the recollection of the forms, and I was then reassured and appeased. So I pair this with his portrait of Violet Hayman from 1910. I think it really captures his ability to do realism, but also shows that he chooses not to. And why he chooses not to. It doesn't satisfy him, fundamentally, to paint something or draw something realistically. So, this is the first of his noir works that I want to show. This is The Cube from 1880, and I paired this quote with it. Charcoal does not allow kindness. It is sober, and only with real emotion can you draw results from it. He had a particular fascination, especially in these noirs, for floating heads and floating eyes, parts of faces disembodied floating in the air. So you can see, especially for something from 1880, this is very strange and dreamlike and abstract. It does not make any kind of logical sense. There is no clear story going on. This is his piece, The Crying Spider, from 1881. This is a very good example of one of his monster figures in his noir series. He enjoyed drawing monsters at this time. He made a lot of them, but the way he renders monsters, he gives them a lot of pathos, a lot of you want to feel a lot of empathy for them. This sad crying spider figure, while he looks scary, doesn't look like he wants to harm you. He is a pretty miserable looking little creature. And I think it's particularly interesting that he draws these monsters with this humanity, given that his family made their wealth out of being slave traders, out of actively being enslavers. I think that's a really dark but interesting contrast to think about, that he would be capable of humanizing the idea of a monster, but his family dehumanizes actual human beings for profit. This is another example of a noir monster. This is The Origins, Plate 3 from 1883. He had a particular fascination for Cyclops. We will see a Cyclops later in this. I think it's really interesting to look at how scratchy he has rendered it, particularly the fine wisps of hair. It looks like one giant eyelash that then blends into this short frazzled bob for this Cyclops creature. Then here's another noir. This one is Christ from 1887. Again, you see very, very heavy contrast in this. He did a few... Christ is a reoccurring figure in his work. There's a few from his noirs, and there's a lot of them later in his life. And I think it's interesting to look at how he renders Christ in this. There is another Christ later on, which I will compare this to, and you'll see how he goes from a very sad Christ to more of Christ as a peaceful savior. So this is the first colored work I wanted to bring in. This is Closed Eyes from 1889. There is a more finished Closed Eyes that he made later that is not in here. But I think this is an interesting look at how he's starting to use color. So this is pretty monotone, and the figure is fairly realistic. Like the chiaroscuro that he's used, you can see the forms of the body, but it's still a bit floaty and dreamlike, like this halo around the figure. It's not clear if this is a biblical figure or who they might be. And they're on this, like, blended color field. You can see a bunch of different colors in the background behind them. And really, Odilon Redon starting to play with color more. So this is the first piece that I included that shows what his style looks like for the rest of his life. This is Pegasus and the Muse from 1900. And this is a very, very colorful piece. He is known, if not for his noirs, then he is known for being a colorist and for being very skilled in his usage of color and very freely using color. To me, these pieces always come off as glittering. The way he contrasts those like darker, muddier grays with those bright blues, and those bright blues are contrasted against the yellows, and you see every color of the rainbow in this piece. And it's very abstract. Like the female figure and the Pegasus look fairly realistic. They're recognizable at the very least, and then the rest just becomes this strange dream of clouds and almost alien plant life and a golden field. It's very, very dreamlike. This is his piece Bouquet of Flowers from around 1905 to 1910. I'm not entirely sure. We're not really sure when this was done. Bouquets of flowers are another reoccurring motif, which is why I wanted to include this, even in his more abstract, colorist, pastel period. He still has a lot of these, flower, specifically flowers in vases. There's countless flowers in vases that he rendered. At his time, he was also a very big fan of Charles Darwin, and that does show up in his work. The idea of like the horrors of mutation, but also a fascination with the natural world and how plants work. So if you look, you can see that these are flowers, but they're also surrounded by butterflies. And I think it's interesting to consider, that Darwin's theories were like new at this time. And, being able to watch this artist working with those ideas. This is his piece Buddha from 1910. Much like his drawings of Christ, Odilon Redon actually made a lot of pastels of Buddha, specifically Buddha in a garden of flowers. I didn't see anything particularly about why he was so fixated on Buddha. I imagine it probably ties a lot into the intense, Orientalism that was happening at the time. But it is interesting to see that he is not only making figures of Christ, but also figures from a different, set of beliefs. And if we look at this, the garden that Buddha is in is very dreamlike, very abstract. There's just color behind him. It's not clear what it is. There's flowers springing up, but they're oversized and they're strange looking. It is peaceful, but it is definitely very unusual, especially looking at other things from this time period. This is Butterflies from 1910. Again, another reoccurring motif. He had a lot of paintings and drawings of butterflies. I went with this one because it seemed like one of the most popular of them. They are all very similar. They are all of butterflies flying. A number of butterflies like this of all different types flying around. I think, again, it's just interesting to contrast this with those noirs from earlier in his career. It really seems like the imagination, which he said guided his work, his imagination was becoming more colorful, becoming more light. So this is Sacred Heart from 1910. This is that later pastel work of Christ. And you can see, if we go to a side-by-side comparison, how much his style has changed. So at this point, he is in his 70s. Late 60s, early 70s. And his work has become so much more about big blocks of color and colors blending into each other and feeling and motion, as opposed to, anatomy. And I think also just tonally, if we look at these two depictions of Christ, Christ and Sacred Heart, you can see that the lithograph of Christ is a suffering Christ. It is Christ with a crown of thorns who is looking up towards God. And then the other Christ, whose eyes are closed, this darker skinned Christ, with this explosion of gold and red around where his heart would be. It seems almost as if this has gone from imagining Christ as a a figure who exemplifies suffering for a greater cause, which is how he viewed his service in the war, to a Christ of redemption, a Christ of forgiveness, the ideas of, eternal rest. I think this is a very good way to contrast those. And then lastly, another very famous piece of his, Cyclops, from 1914. I paired it with this quote, "True art lies in a reality that is felt." So I wanted to end on Cyclops today because I think Cyclops exemplifies a lot of Odilon Redon's work, especially his pastels and his usage of monsters. So again, this is another Cyclops. This is depicting a myth. This Cyclops fell in love with, I believe she is a dryad or a nymph. He fell in love with her, but she would have rejected him because Cyclops are horrifying monsters. Normally, he is depicted as an aggressor, but in this version, she is lounging in a field of what we can assume to be flowers, although if you actually look at it, it's just blobs of color all combined together. And the Cyclops is peering over a mountain. And the Cyclops doesn't look like he is predatory. He looks a bit sad. He looks a bit sweet. He seems less like he is being a voyeur and more like he's too shy to approach her. And I think it's interesting to look at this, especially as one of his works from, only about 2 years before he would pass, that he has gone from putting these monsters, these sad monsters in these empty voids, to putting them in these beautiful color fields, these vibrant, highly contrasted pastel works. And while they retain that core humanity, it feels to me almost as though there might be a good ending for this Cyclops. Even though in the actual story there isn't. With the way he looks out towards the viewer with that sad smile, it does make you almost wish he was able to be more normal, to be able to interact with her in a more normal way. And I think it really shows his, I suppose, dedication to humanizing a monster. But again, and I can't emphasize it enough, it is really important to contrast that with how he was able to become an artist in the first place. Him being able to become an artist and be successful at it, be able to have that opportunity, is because his family had wealth. And his family directly had wealth from the slave trade. A lot of things that talk about him don't mention that. They just say that he came from a prosperous family and that he was a happy child. But I think especially when you're talking about a artist who is known for humanizing monsters, it's really important to know that he wasn't humanizing humans. And that is my presentation on Odilon Redon, and how he chose to make art by fabricating a reality that does not exist. Thank you.